Welcome to the People, Property, Place podcast with me, your host, Matthew Watts, founder and managing director of Rockborn. This is a podcast where I share the stories, views, opinions and career journeys of the movers, shakers, innovators and leaders in the real estate industry. Welcome to the People, Property, Place podcast. Today we're joined by Vanessa Davey, equity partner at Quadrant. Quadrant work with a variety of best-in-class LPs from KKR, Tristan, Aimco, Blackrock and Oaktree and invest in UK real estate assets across the risk spectrum with a focus on managing, repurposing and developing offices, out-of-town retail and leisure assets. Vanessa's worked at the business since 2014, having joined from CBRE and has had a meteoric rise up the ranks. Vanessa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Well, look, a place I always like to start these podcasts is how did you get into real estate?
Yes, so I think I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts and it seems like quite a few of us have kind of fallen into real estate and I'm definitely one of these people. I was always quite an all-rounder at school. I liked math, I liked economics, I liked biology and I liked languages. And when it came to choosing a course to study at university, I came across land economy, which I had no idea what it really meant other than it was described as economics, environment and law. I thought, oh, that sounds quite interesting. Not too much focus on one, but kind of continuing my kind of well-rounded education, I suppose. And applied, got and moved to the UK. And as I went through the 3 years of my BA, realized that the course was actually quite good for getting into business full stop, whether it was accounting, finance, or property. And it turned out to be RICS accredited. And I've always had an interest in the built environment. I think whilst I was quite well-rounded, I wasn't very good at physics. So sadly, architecture was out the picture, but I'd always loved buildings. And I guess mixing economics and learning about what's going on in the world and how things are interconnected together with the built environment kind of led me to property. Sadly, though, I finished university in 2008 and it was really quite difficult to get a job, particularly in any kind of business, finance kind of sectors. Applied to the big grad scheme, but most of them got reduced to very few graduates. And made it to final rounds, didn't make it onto any of the graduate scheme. And part of the feedback was I was too academic and not commercial enough.
Really?
And I think this is when I kind of realized I was competing with people who'd done masters at the likes of Readings and Oxford Brookes, really specializing in getting people into property with a lot of interaction with, senior people in the industry, the ability to get work experience and so on, which I was born in France, so I didn't really have the network here, nor even things as simple as I would apply to work experience. But, can you come next week? I'm like, well, the only thing is I don't really have accommodation here. I live in the south of France. I can jump on the plane, but I need to figure out. And it just was very difficult.
I was going to ask you, because what prompted you to apply to, obviously, Cambridge's, world leading, if not best, top 2, top 10, whatever, university. What was it that you wanted to leave the south of France and go and apply to a course over in the UK?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. The French education system is brilliant in terms of up to, kind of high school level. And I actually attended an international school that was a state-sponsored school. So it's the French curriculum with extra English. So I had 10 hours of English a week from the age of 10, 11 onwards. And then the last 2 years, I moved towards the IB because the French education system after high school is very much based on the numbers of years of studies. So to get the equivalent of a kind of a Cambridge BA, you actually need to do 5 years of studies in France, of which is 2 years of prep school, where you work non-stop to then get into the equivalent, I suppose, of a university, what they call Grande École. And it just didn't really appeal to me. And to be honest, I had quite an international background. I was fluent in French, English, and Spanish. And I just thought, actually, if I don't want to be based in France long term, do I really want to study 5 years for something that's not as recognized worldwide than a top British university?
And is that just to get your undergrad? And then a lot of French real estate professionals that I've spoken to have gone on and done a master's as well, right? And there's a real emphasis on that further education. And whereas I guess graduates in the UK, probably graduate at 21, 22 France, it's 25 plus, right, before they even like enter the world.
Yeah, and it's very much based on for a number of years. So you talk about like, oh, what have you? And you say back, which is the high school diploma, +5, and that means you've studied for 5 years thereafter. And it just feels, to me, it felt like not a very commercial approach of studying, but not putting anything in practice. And actually, the one thing that I think the property industry needs to rethink is the need to do a master's to enter into most of the graduate scheme, unless the market's doing very well and you can join as a non-cog. But I think that really sets a barrier to entry and automatically means only certain people will apply. I think I was really lucky as an undergrad. I think if I'd been passionate about wanting to get into property, I could have probably made it work to do a master's. But yes, you learn a lot in masters. Do I feel like I would have been any better in my job? Probably in my first year, but after a year, you can learn everything you need on the job is the reality.
Yeah.
And Michael said very little property. It was MRC accredited, but it was very, very
Really?
little property. We did a couple of modules in valuation, which was so theoretical, we had no idea what it actually meant in reality. And I don't think it did me a disservice not having done it in terms of my career. And I think, we're talking about diversity of backgrounds and being more inclusive. Well, I think if masters wasn't a compulsory thing to become a chartered surveyor, it would probably be a lot more inclusive.
Yeah, I think suddenly the big kind of universities like Reading, Oxford Brookes, a lot of them kind of get in on an undergrad. The masters, a lot of them do from if they've done a business course and then want to get into real estate, and they do that year. How many people would you say were in that cohort in your land economy? Because it's quite a small group of individuals, right? And I know they've got like the MPhil, which is the master's course that is opened up maybe a little bit bigger, but it's still quite a small cohort.
Yes, I think we were one of the biggest years, and we were 50 odd students, of which 8 went into property.
Oh wow!
Probably only about 4 or 5 are still in property.
Interesting.
So yes, it's one of those strange courses, which means that the positives is it was a bit broader. So you probably had more of a global kind of awareness and awareness of other sectors. But the negatives is you don't have that network that on my graduate scheme. So CBRE didn't take anyone in 2009, and then they merged 2 years in 2010 when I finally got into the property industry. And so we were 40 odd people, and I would say half of them were from Reading masters of 2 different years, so 2008 and 2009.
Interesting. So you left Cambridge in 2008. GFC was right. Tell me about that time and your kind of mindset and kind of coming out of like one of the top universities, being told probably you're going to walk into or have a load of different job offers once you kind of graduate from this school. What was going on then?
Yeah, let's just say it didn't happen like that. I think a few of my friends had done internships, long internships, particularly around kind of accounting, management consultancy, and banking the summer of the second year. I didn't, because I decided that actually I didn't want to go into finance. I wanted something concrete I could hold on to, and property was the thing I wanted to do. And a lot of them got jobs secured at the end of their internship. The rest of us who applied in our third year found it very difficult. 2007, 2008, not the best time to be applying for a new job when everyone's being made redundant left, right and centre. I spent the summer of 2008 at home applying for jobs so far, and then realised I just needed to be in the UK for interviews. So off I went in September, packed my bags. My parents paid for 1 month's rent and deposit, and were like, just go and get a job. And thinking I could work in whatever industry I could get a job in, whilst studying a bit more, meeting more people in the commercial real estate industry. I got a job very quickly in recruitment, doing recruiting accountants in the financial sectors. The only problem was I started the morning of Lehman Brothers collapse. So within 6 weeks, the team was dismantled, and I was told that my job was no longer there. To call it a shock at 21, when you've come, as you say, from a top university and realize you've got no jobs, you're in a country without any of your family, and you've been made redundant, it's hard. But it also teaches you a lot about yourself. And, calling my parents on the phone crying, like, I can't believe I've lost my job already. And then that afternoon, actually, I kind of pulled myself together and went to see recruiters and was like, right, it's time to get another job. I've only got 1 month worth of money. I need to get another job. And within a week of starting in sales at a research house doing emerging markets. What I liked about it was international. I could further my commercial skills, which apparently were lacking from what I'd heard as feedback from my interviews with the property companies. And yeah, so off I went, spent 18 months traveling around Europe, selling research and research information to European governments. And it was an incredible learning curve. Amazing to boost your confidence and your ability to talk to people. I mean, I was in European Central Bank a few times, talking to the research teams. My first transaction was actually to the Belgium Central Bank. I saw them, small amount of research on China and felt very proud of myself, picked myself up, got on to do it. But it was a sales job at the end of the day with, lots of monitoring of the numbers of calls done, the hours on the phone, business trips every other week, which sounds really glamorous at first. And then you realize actually traveling on your own is quite lonely. And really, I just wanted to get back into property. So spend my time. And then when the graduate schemes finally reopened, as I said, most of them didn't take anyone in 2009. When they kind of reopened, I'd applied to quite a few jobs. And I think I did a good sales performance for my first year and suddenly decided, okay, I've got enough money saved now to not work for 3 months. So let's go and really get into property, do whatever I need to do, work free, do work experience. And actually I got offered a place on a 2 weeks graduate kind of recruitment work experience program at Cushman's. And whilst it was at Cushman's, it was 2 weeks, I got offered a place at CBRE as well. And having made quite good friends with the people who were doing the work experience, I'm like, guys, I'm out. Since one less person you're competing with for the place, I'll go to CBRE.
So you really hustled it. I guess you had no choice, right?
Yeah, I didn't really have much of a choice. But those moments that feel quite tough are the way you learn about yourself, about your personality, and about what you want. And I think it, kind of showed in CBRE, like, yeah, well, okay, well, from the first time we saw you to now, you've obviously grown in commercial awareness and you clearly want this. And it just installed in me as well a work ethic, I think, that, you've got to work for what you want. Nothing's given to you, or if it is, it's temporary. You're still going to have to work to keep what you've got.
Yeah.
So April 2010 started my career at CBRE. Rotated around for 2.5 years. I did some rent review work in the Central London office team, then did valuation, and finally landed in retail, which was what I thought I wanted to do all along, doing Central London estates, landlord work. So worked on some fantastic estates, such as the Covent Garden estates for Capco, the nice British estate for Chelsfield, and really started understanding kind of the piece around asset management, growing rents, growing the tone, growing the tenant mix, making places appealing for both brands and customers, and the impact on valuation as well. So really great experience. Yeah.
And so did you have a preference over kind of an agency seat or kind of a valuation seat? Or I'm just intrigued because clearly you're, from an intellectual perspective, you've got a very strong and good understanding, but then also that kind of like sales piece you kind of further developed. Did you have a preference over kind of vals and, more research and report based work, or more kind of, client facing and origination kind of agency and tenant rep type work?
So I think when you're a graduate, for me, it's all about learning. And actually, I didn't want to specialize into anything at that point. I just wanted to learn as much as I could. And that's what I loved about rotating, but rotating whilst being there long enough. So one of the things I liked about CBRE is you actually mentioned you only 2 seats in 2 years, but because we did 2.5 years to merge 2 years together, I managed to get 3 seats in. And for me, that was the biggest thing. It was learning enough to start becoming useful, but also understanding enough to move on to the next seat to build on your knowledge. I really enjoyed valuation from the kind of theoretical kind of aspects, but I actually wanted to be in control. And I mean, that's what kind of transpired over all these things, is that you can make recommendation as an advisor, whether it's consultancy, valuation, or transactions, but ultimately you don't make the decisions. And I think I was quite frustrated with, people who've got different reasons for making decisions or not. And I think at a point I realized I'm not meant to be an advisor. I like taking responsibility for my actions. I don't have a problem making decisions and justifying my decisions, but I actually find it very frustrating when, you're kind of giving advice as someone does something else, even if they may have some really valid reasons. For me not be able to see those reasons for doing something or not, which you're not always privy to as a consultant, was quite hard. And that's when I was like, okay,
So you got qualified, and did you stay a couple of extra years once you got qualified?
Yes. So I stayed nearly 5 years at CBRE. Part of me had it in my head that to move client side, where you have a lot more responsibility, I needed to be more senior. And then it came to a stage where I just felt like I'd learned everything I could about estates without becoming a specialist central London retail leasing agent. And actually, I was much more interested in value creation. And I kind of realized the investment piece, the writing of business plan and putting in practice was kind of where I wanted to be involved. So I thought, let's round up my skills with doing a bit of investment. As trying to move Italian is very difficult at the time. As you can imagine, a big organization like CBRE has got so many people in so many places, and it's just difficult to move around. And I think I got to a stage where I said, okay, maybe it is time to go and see what's out there. And went to see a recruiter, your old job, and started interviewing client side roles. Really interesting process when you're trying to figure out what you want to do. And I think my background meant people were pushing me towards asset management, although also interviewed for a role said, well, actually you leasing people don't know anything about asset management. I thought, well, yeah, but I do valuation as well, and I've done rent review. So actually when you combine it all together, it is basically asset management. And yeah, this is when you see some of the barriers that people say, no, if you haven't done that specifically, I can't recruit you, rather than recruiting individuals based on their qualities, merits, and ability to learn.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, because also your point earlier about, in your mind, you thought the more senior I get, the more experience I get, that's going to help me make the move over. When sometimes that's counterintuitive, because other people were saying, well, if we're going to take someone from the advisory side and bring them over to the principal side, actually looking at my team dynamic and experience level, I'd rather take someone who's just qualified, who's got that like hunger and drive, and then I can mold them and I can pay them whatever I need to pay them, rather than throw the kilter out in my team. So it's an interesting kind of like mindset shift as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come on no doubt to how we got to know each other a bit better. We're recruiting both for our business now, but that's suddenly what you've learned over the years does impact how you react later on in life, I think. So yeah, no, I interviewed at quite a few places. I think I was honest with CBRE because we were having issues with one of our clients where a lot of personnel had moved and they were about to send me on a trip. And I was like, look, guys, I got to be honest with you. I want to move. I don't want you to lose the client. I think if I'm, the next person to be on their account leaving again, I don't think it's going to go down well. So perhaps pull me out of this. And they appreciated my honesty. And yeah, ended up having to decide between small firms and big firms. And I think what I learned from CBRE is you're very much a cog in a big machine. And your ability to influence things is difficult. Yes, there's lots of sub teams, but actually, if you want to work as a bigger collaboration between different teams, it can be quite tricky. And I've just from that and the fact that my dad was a serial entrepreneur who owned did up businesses and sold them, I just always thought actually working for a smaller business is what I want. But it felt like a big decision. I'd lost my job as a 21 years old. I was 26 and I was trying to say, oh, do I take the job? In hindsight, I was with my long-term partner at the time with no risk, no family, no mortgage. Frankly, it was not a risk at all. But at the time, it felt like the biggest decision to me, and got on really well with the team at Quadrant and decided, why not? Let's go. So they offered me a role in the retail team, which wasn't defined as anything specific, whether it was asset management or investment. I was the 10th person in the business. So it was 2014. And I like that. I like the small business, but with a track record as well. So they'd done some great deals. They were about to exit 3 deals in the city with blue chip names such as, Blackrock, Carval, Orion, City of London as partners. So done very well, as well as being a new joint venture with KKR buying retail warehouse. And that's why I joined, is really to help on that side, both on the asset management as well as on the investment side. And I learned a huge amount. The 2 founding partners are, expert at what they do, Christopher Daniel and Tristan. In my earlier part of my career, I worked mostly with Christopher Daniel. And really start to understand what it means to be client side, but more specifically what it means to be an operating partner.
Yeah, in a small business where there's nowhere to hide, right?
Exactly.
So did you have, as well as that, were you naturally, from an underwriting and modelling perspective, were you naturally quite gifted on that side, or were you having to kind of go on courses outside of your day job, or were you kind of trained on the job there when you joined the business?
So I joined to help both sides. I actually got given a modelling test, and I knew, the first thing you kind of learn from speaking to recruiters, well, if you're thinking of going into asset management / investment, you really need to get your modelling up to scratch. So I spent quite a few weekends kind of going over building Excel models. As I said, my My partner's luckily in property as well, so I spent quite a lot of time with him kind of going through models. Even if you've done valuation and you've done cash flows, actually building it yourself is different to just relying on a template, which is what a lot of agents do. And yeah, I got given a modeling test at Quadrant, which I passed. But then I got to the best week and I got given the model, which was built by the kind of the head of transaction at the time. And it could not understand how it worked at all. And I spent the first 2 weeks like, have I oversold myself? Have I said I can do something that I can't do? And actually spent a couple of weekends just going through every cell, trying to really understand it, and quickly got my head around. I was like, no, okay, you're just feeling a bit overwhelmed, so much to learn, but actually you've got this, you can do this. And quickly learned how to use the model and was underwriting things, learned on the job a lot of it, because the modeling part is one side, the other side of it is understanding what you're putting in the model. And everyone who works in kind of analysis will know the term of garbage in, garbage out, but it really is that, you put assumptions that are ridiculous and you'll get ridiculous returns. Whether you can then convince an investor to back you up on that or not is something else. And that was really the second bit of it. I was learning. I didn't know much about the retail warehouse market. I'd done mostly central London luxury, high-end kind of retail up to that stage. And the retail warehouse market it's slightly different, although it still is about tenant mix. It still is about affordability, rent to turnover ratios, and footfall. So it's kind of taking my knowledge from my years of CBRE and applying that to a slightly different sector.
With different tenants.
With different tenants, absolutely. Although there's been over the last few years quite a lot of crossover, not so much in the luxury market, but in the mid to mass market, where there's been quite a lot of brands who've historically been present on the high street started moving to retail warehouse. And we truly, at the time I didn't really know what I was walking into, but actually with all the structural changes we've had, I truly believe that retail warehouse is the most resilient of the retail sectors and the best place to capitalize on what's happened with e-commerce and kind of the interaction between in-store and online. It's an amazing sector for the way the units are configured. You're talking big box, easy to compartmentalize, easy to change size if you need to, with big service yards at the back, so good for deliveries. Mezzanine spaces, if installed by tenants, are free. So, and generally incredibly well located just off main arterial roads. So from a kind of last mile delivery, it's great locations. And as well as for click and collect, a lot of people order things online because they find it frustrating going into a store and not finding what they've seen online that they wanted. But a lot of people order several sizes, for example, in the fashion world. And rather than having to then go to the post office and post it back, being able to give it back in store is amazing. So you can try it at stores in the changing room, send it back there and then, or maybe buy an accessorize to go with it. So yeah, it's an amazing sector for how well it's integrated and with the online aspects. And we've seen that really through the pandemic. It was the most resilient sector by a long way.
Interesting. So you brought on initially with the KKR kind of out of town retail kind of mandate. What was kind of the business plan and the view? Is it kind of like a typical PE 3-5 year business plan? Or was it a little bit longer in terms of amassing a portfolio and then selling it?
Yeah, so the idea was always to buy more than one asset and try and get a bit of scale. And they'd always been kind of 5-year minimum business plans. So when I joined, the team they bought a portfolio of 3 assets called the Tuscany portfolio. And then we were in the process of buying the last phase of our Junction 9 Gallagher main retail park. And then within 3 or 4 months, we bought another asset in Glasgow as well, which actually was more of a high street block / shopping centres, but with key tenants known to us, so Primark, TK Maxx and so on. And I actually went on to look after the assets. So not only was I involved in the transaction from day one, but I then got to asset manage and do a bit of development as well on it, which was great from a learning perspective. So yeah, the intention was to do a sizable portfolio. We were KKR's first European partner, and it was a learning curve for them and for us in terms of every time you work with a new partner, you've got to understand what they really care about. To work with private equity houses, you need to be incredibly detailed, look at the data in every possible way and look at all sorts of scenarios. So you have to be very disciplined in your approach to assets underwriting, which again was fantastic to learn. And I think it's very much the way Quadrant operates now. It's all about the detail. It's all about looking at things in various ways and underwriting both the upside and the downside. So you know what you're stepping into. So we sold out of the retail warehouse portfolio with KKR between 2016 and 2018, maybe we sold even one in 2015, and it did perform really well. Unfortunately, we didn't end up buying more with KKR because the structural changes in retail were happening faster and faster, particularly in the US. At that time, they were still basing quite a lot of the decisions out of a US IC committee, who just couldn't get their head around retail, even if it's very different in the UK because of planning regulations. There's a restriction on supply which doesn't exist really in the US, where as soon as any mall opens up, the one next door becomes desolate and everyone leaves. We don't quite have that in the UK market, certainly not on retail warehouse.
So you worked on that kind of project. Were you working on other projects at the same time, or was it just the kind of the retail warehousing was your kind of main principal focus from a transaction underwriting, asset management development perspective? And is that where you kind of really cut your teeth on being a principal and what it takes to work as an operating partner reporting into a US PE shop?
Yeah, until 2019, my focus was solely retail warehouse. And it's absolutely where I learned the trade, and the best way to learn is being thrown in the deep end and doing a bit of everything. If you want to be great at investment, you really need to understand the fundamentals, and that's occupational demand. Ultimately, you buy something on the basis you're going to get an income return, and the income return is derived from your tenants, your occupiers. So truly understanding the occupier, their needs, their requirements, as well as the mechanics of leases, rent reviews, all that technical side of it is really important to underwriting well. And yeah, that's where I learned.
So what are the key fundamentals that you look for from a creditworthiness perspective of a tenant? So assessing a tenant A versus tenant B, how do you understand and work that one out?
Yeah, so I think looking at an investment in general, whatever the sector, you kind of look at the level of income, likelihood of the tenant paying, the creditworthiness of the tenant, and therefore, how much are you ready to pay for that income, for the certainty of that income in the future. I think with retail, it's a bit different because it's about creating places. So it's about placemaking. And it's also with retail warehouses specifically, it's from an asset management point of view, all of the evidence that you create it on the park. So you've got to really understand who are your tenants. Yes, the financial background, how likely are they to still be here? And if you're starting a number of times, we've had 2 offers from similar retailers, but actually we know that one has got a long history. We know how they work. We know they don't have that much debt. And then there's one new business with lots of debt, much more aggressive on rent, and we've sometimes picked the lower rent tenant just because we know the business is more likely to be there long term. So with retail, I think you've got to look at things slightly differently, and then you've got to be aware of the evidence you're creating. So doing one deal at a low rent may mean that then you struggle to maintain the tone on the park. So you look at it slightly differently in retail, and I think retail is actually quite a complicated sector. So if you can do retail, you can generally work across other sectors as well.
You mentioned tone on the park. Someone listening who might not have heard that expression before, can you just explain what tone on the park means and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So the landlord and tenant relationship is guided by the 1954 Act, which gives tenants protection. So at the end of a lease, a tenant has got the right to renew, and often during a 10-year lease, you'd have a 5-year rent review. Under this, the tenant and the landlord will argue where the rent should be, and it's often you base it on comparable evidence of other deals done. When you've got a retail park, you often use the evidence you've created on your own park. So the rental tone that you've achieved on your previous letting, you have a lot of adjustments to do for the size of the units, for the configuration of the units. It's relatively technical, but the general principle of asset management, I suppose, is making sure you've got the right brands and going to thrive, but also move on with the rent and create a longer term rental profile with growth in it.
So there's lots of different pieces to the jigsaw, from selecting the right tenant to create a destination, and you're prepared to take maybe a potential hit on the rental income from that tenant, because that tenant will maybe draw in other tenants that will create an overall destination and collective. But you need to be super mindful in terms of like setting a particular rent at a level, because it could have a material impact on how you how you rent the other units, but also the overall capital value of that investment if you're looking to exit it.
Absolutely. It's constantly balancing the tenant mix with the rental profile, I suppose.
So Quadrant isn't just an out-of-town and leisure specialist. It's got a long track record in the office space. In terms of you and your move, can you just tell me a little bit more about how you maybe positioned and moved into the office part of the business? And yeah, give me a bit of an overview of the kind of the deals that you've historically done and have done on that side.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, I joined Quadrant in 2014. From 2014 to early 2019, I did just retail. So as we've discussed, KKR was one of our biggest investors, but we also did a number of transactions with other types of capital, some of core plus capital, such as Ashby Capital, with whom we bought 3 assets between 2015 and 2019, and we still manage those retail parks for Ashby, as well as being appointed as asset manager by a number of other investment partners, such as Tristan Capital, M&S. And so I kind of worked on that side of the business, but I started focusing more and more on the investment side, the transaction side, and both in terms of the investment analysis. So when you first get details of a potential deal, trying to see quickly whether it could work or not, as well as then the real detail of the transaction once you've got asset under offer. And that covers, obviously working with our investment partners to make sure all the due diligence is done, from the property to the corporate due diligence. We do quite a lot of corporate transactions. We've also bought a few distressed assets where there's been debt in the mix, to structuring how we're going to hold those assets or change anything in the companies that we're buying, and then putting debt on as well, in a structure moving forward to manage it, both in terms of if it's offshore managers as well as the asset managers at Quadrant. So really being involved in transaction from a legal, accounting, property kind of aspects. And from that, in 2019, we had 2 assets that we've been tracking for many years that suddenly came live, and I had the transaction move. So I kind of moved into that role, and so doing both retail and office transactions. And as we grew, we've actually got now my team, which is the transaction analysis team, whereby we are involved in buying the projects, but then also monitoring the performance throughout, and we kind of sit between the retail asset managers and the office development guys.
Before we come on to the kind of couple of amazing schemes that you bought from an office perspective. So you mentioned structuring. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit further? Because some people think you buy a property for 50 million quid, spend 20 on it, and then end up selling it for 150 million pounds, and everyone's happy, they made a return. But where does structuring, and what is structuring? Why is it important?
Yeah, so of course we're buying property, as you said, to make a return, and whether it's a capital return from refurbishing a building and then selling it, filling it to good tenants, or whether it's managing an existing building and improving the income, so from a dry asset. In both cases, there's a number of costs that come off that income and they impact your returns. And structuring is about minimizing those costs as much as possible, particularly around taxation and around administrative cost. Depending on where the assets are in terms of different jurisdictions around the world. So quite a lot of assets will be UK, some will be Jersey or Lux. And then where your investors' money comes from, you will have different dual tax treaty, different ways of mitigating tax, different regimes. So it's very, very technical. But we'll always rely on accountants to help you out, no matter how much of an expert you are. And all the big PE houses have got their own accountants in-house, but they will still rely on external accountants because it's changing constantly. So every new transaction and nearly every year on all projects, you kind of have to review, have there been any new legislation which could impact us? And the main ones really that changed over the last few years is surrounding non-resident landlords. So a lot of structuring was done by Jersey and Luxembourg historically because there was tax benefits. If you bought a company, you wouldn't be paying stamp duty, and then you could sell that company onwards, not getting any capital gains tax. This has been kind of semi-cut now. It's not possible anymore, but it does mean that something that was giving you maybe a 18% IRR, not 25% of your profits if you're paying capital gains at the corporation tax rate, which is when all foreign landlords do on us, they've got special tax agreements. It's just losing a lot of your profit, 25% gone. So being aware of all of that from day one, so you can make sure that your assumptions include the right tax assumption and the right tax structure that is the most efficient, is very important.
Interesting. I guess, people can talk for days about different structuring, the ways of doing it, but talk to me about the office schemes that you have, 30 South Colonnade and the other one down in Nine Elms?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first transaction we did when I kind of started looking at offices in 2019 was 30 South Colonnade, and that was an interesting structure. It was an asset owned by a Chinese company called H&A. They wanted to stay involved a little bit, and we ended up structuring a deal whereby they were a silent partner in the background, but means they could get a bit of a slice of the upside, and we paid probably a lower price at entry. It's a fantastic project. It's, I would say that, of course, but the best building in Canary Wharf. When you get out of the Jubilee Line and Jubilee Park, there's the old Reuters building that had the ticker tape on it. There we bought a company, we restructured it. There was a lot of different property companies involved. So it's about making it as lean as possible so that in the future someone can understand quite quickly the structure and, reduce their legal cost and accounting cost. The less companies are involved, the easier it is for everyone to look at it and do due diligence. And it was a 300,000 square feet whereby we've added 100,000 square feet going up 3 floors. We wouldn't necessarily go to Canary Wharf generally because it's controlled by the Canary Wharf Group. But if you can have the best building and create a product that's slightly different than what it's known for, we thought it was an interesting position at much lower rents than what is available in the city. So with BGY Architect, we redesigned the building. It's absolutely stunning. It's now called YMI due to the arches that we've created both at the bottom and the top of the building. We strive for the best in class amenities and the best in class ESG performance, and that's reflected in the fact that it will be a BREEAM outstanding EPCA well platinum ready building, and but at a much reduced rent to what you would have to pay in the city.
Interesting. And you haven't knocked the whole building down. It's a building using a terminology like with good bones. Is that right? So Can you just expand on how you've gone about redeveloping it, but also minimizing your carbon footprint?
Absolutely. Something we're very mindful of. It's a lot of the Canary Wharf buildings have got very good structures, and looking at it, it had some good ceiling heights, fundamentally, and it had some good floor plates, although we didn't like where the core was located. So that's what we kind of call good bones. Is the structure, the physical structure of the building good enough to reuse, or do you need to knock it down and start again? Sometimes it's cheaper to knock it down and start again. In this case, we had to reinforce an awful lot of the structure to be able to add more weight and move the core. But from a carbon perspective, it made complete sense to keep that structure rather than take everything out and rebuild it either in steel or concrete and have all of that, cost to the environment, I suppose, of disposing of the waste and using more resources. So absolutely, we've reused the frame. We've got amazing floor to ceiling height on the first and second floors because they were trading floors. And we've got good ceiling height on the other floors, and then the top floors, which are brand new, are also incredible ceiling height with incredible views because it opens onto a plaza. So you've got so much natural light coming in, and it's quite unusual, I suppose, in kind of tall building areas to got so much natural light and views over the docks as well.
Yeah, it's an amazing building, and you're right. It's got prime location as soon as you come out of the tube, and I guess the Elizabeth line, opens it up. And makes it way more accessible. So yeah, whenever I venture down into Canary Wharf, I'm always amazed at the progress on site, and I'm excited to see the finished article. Talk to you about your Nine Elms development and that project and why that's interesting, and also from a location as well, because it's not a kind of typical central London West End or City place.
Absolutely, and I think that the point you just made is absolutely valid. The one of the main reasons for us buying that Canary Wharf building was the opening of Crossrail. For us, it's all about infrastructure plays. The locations are changing slightly. An awful lot of the work is being done by Canary Wharf and creating more of a mixed-use community with residential, retail, so a lot of the amenities are there. But the transport is super important, and actually from our offices opposite Selfridges to Canary Wharf, if there's a train there, we can be there in 15 minutes,
wow,
which is just incredible. Nine Elms, kind of a similar play in terms of infrastructure, and having a big level next to you doing an awful lot of work to improve the area. So Battersea Power Station obviously is now, the power station itself is now open after phase 1 being open for quite a few years now. It's absolutely incredible, provides amazing amenities in terms of the restaurants there, the retail there is really incredible. But more importantly, their involvement has meant that the Northern Line extension has finally happened. And again, it's now very quick. It's 2 stops from Waterloo to get there. And for us, again, it was a new infrastructure, meant a new location becoming much more accessible and interesting. And then again, it's a mixed-use community. We're really loving having offices in mixed-use areas the whole idea of the 10-minute city where you can do everything from one location. You can live on site, you could walk to work if you needed to, you can walk to a restaurant at lunchtime. All of these things are really interesting and makes it really, from an ESG point of view, it's being part of a community, which, well, the S of ESG, was really liked. And again, there we had found on the site quite a few years ago. It was part of the Royal Mail Master Plan. It was due to be a residential building, and we said to them, well, look, it's got such a great location. It's opposite the entrance to the tube station. We think it should be an office. And then went and got planning, and we were one of a handful of parties to look at it, and we got it because we believed in the location so much. We ended up buying this with Aimco, that's Albert Investment Management Corporation, who, for whom sustainability is really important. So once again, we kind of redesigned the building slightly, managed to add a floor and create this really cool space with balconies on every floor. Lots of greenery around. There's the new linear park being created, which will link Vauxhall to the Battersea Power Station, and we're right on the edge of it. So you've got that on your doorstep as a worker, which is incredible. And creating a brand really with, again, associated with the best in class features. We've got windows that you can open to get some fresh air. The reception opens up in the summer, so you can create that kind of piazza al fresco kind of vibe to it. And again, will be a BREEAM outstanding and EPC-A building. And with Apple taking 500,000 square feet at the power station, it feels to us there will be a lot of associated companies working with Apple, whether it's tech, whether it's, lots of businesses actually located down. If you look at the companies that are in the Embassy Garden building, you've got recruiters, you've got publishers. So people who like to be closer, so that don't necessarily need to be in the West End of the city paying, £80 plus for the best in class building. They can afford to get a much lower rent for a best in class building just on the edge, and it's still very accessible.
Interesting. We spoke about, obviously, like retail tenant mix and placemaking and curation earlier. Is it the same sort of thing when it comes to like office development and acquiring office assets in terms of the makeup of the occupiers, or tech clusters or creative clusters, or is it too early to say what kind of cluster or space Battersea and that area will attract occupier-wise?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. And I suppose that's where the market has changed. Historically, it was very clear if you were a legal firm, you were in Midtown. If you were in a media firm, you were in Soho. If you're a finance firm, you were in the city or Canary Wharf. I think what happened over time is with the lack of stock, of very prime stock, there's lots of stock out there. Vacancies are relatively high at the moment, but there's a lot of grade B stock, which is just not really what occupiers want. And particularly since COVID, it's been much more about the building itself and how accessible the building is than particularly, the exact sub-markets you're in. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still firms who will only be in the city, but it's become a bit more fluid. And it's seen that before COVID anyway, with the likes of new sub-markets such as King's Cross, around Paddington as well. So we'd kind of seen new sub-markets coming up where brothers think, well, actually, it's not that far. I thought there's that right next to the tube station or the train station. It doesn't really matter if it's really the West End or it's 2 stops away. And that's kind of what we were thinking about 9 Elms and Canary Wharf. In terms of the mix itself, yes, you look at the likes of Silicon Valley, and of course, where some of the big tech brands moved, all the tech brands wanted to be located next to each other. I think it's a bit more fragmented here. Obviously, it's quite a lot in King's Cross with Google, Facebook, Apple. They've got an office in the city, and then they've got this one. So who knows where we'll end up. But it's great to have such an anchor. There's really a microcosm of firms working together, which is where you end up with kind of a cluster, but it doesn't preclude other type of companies from joining. From our point of view as an owner, we look at the community and the amenities more than the tenant mix of the office occupiers as such. And that's because, again, to get staff back to the office, you've got to have the best space, but you've got to also have the best amenity in the building and around you. So obvious things are end of trip facilities, and that's what we remember that is a lot of people have picked up cycling during COVID. They want to be able to get to the office, have a warm towel ready for them, safe bike parking, really good showers, be able to say, okay, I've done my exercise, cycling into work, I'm getting changed, I'm out of this in 2 seconds. It's all super easy. Other things, we're looking at, we're part of the Royal Mail Master Plan, so Greystone have got a couple of buildings, they've got a lot of amenities for their people. Can we do deals together? Can we make flats available if you've got people flying from the US? Can you make some of the dining rooms available if you want to host a board meeting? as well as within our own building, having often roof terraces on the top with pods of small amount of space that you could book for a board meeting, a lunch with investors, a event for your staff. So I think all of these things have become really, really important, and it's really important to keep in touch with what the market wants. And buildings that were seen as best in class 3 years ago, which had a BREEAM Excellent and an EPC BE rating, are not seen as best in class anymore. You've got to get to the next level. And yes, it's the ratings element, so the BREEAM Outstanding and the PCA, but it's also all of the amenities that you can offer to make your tenants and their workforce feel fuzzy and happy to be warm and happy to be at work.
It's really interesting, like the role of community and probably the advancement of collaboration with other landlords or potentially competitors or people kind of genuinely placemaking, so it has a net positive effect. I also think it's really interesting from a talent perspective, certainly as a recruiter, that companies and occupiers go to these vast lengths because it's all about people and it's about traction, retention, and making them happy and enabling them to do their best work. And I think historically, and correct me if I'm wrong, the second biggest cost of a business after the cost base of its people is normally its office. So if you're going to be in a grade B office in the West End, and I don't know if it's pound per square foot or the similar cost, but like you said, if you can kind of go to a sub-market a couple of tube stops away, but have a best-in-class awesome business in the heart of the community, it's almost a bit of a no-brainer, especially if you're a service business and you don't actually provide a product that people can fall in love with.
Absolutely. I think that's our thesis. And as the lack of stock, there's not many developments in the West End. A lot of them are pre-lets. So there's, if you want a significant amount of space, there's not many options for you in the West End. There's a bit more coming in the city, although again, a lot of it's pre-let and a lot of it's potentially on hold. So the future pipeline looks good, but actually the costs at the moment have gone so high that it doesn't necessarily stack up to redevelop a building. And by cost, I mean both your financing cost, but your holding to cost, such as taxation, as we talked about, and administrative cost, as well as the construction costs. So as we all know, between the impact of Brexit, I suppose, on workforce availability and materials, as well as the war in Ukraine and general post-COVID supply chain issues, means it is, a lot of people are having to think really hard about whether to develop sites or not. So there's quite a lot of developments on hold at the moment, people waiting to see, whether they press the button or not.
Talk to me about LP relationships and I guess trying to do more than one project with a particular LP, but also are you seeing more LPs come to the market? And maybe somebody doesn't know what an LP is. Can you just tell us what an LP is as well?
Yes. Did we talk about GPs and LPs, and the LPs are limited partners? We actually deal mostly with, historically we've dealt mostly with GPs. So a lot of the private equity firms deal with the LPs directly. So they go fundraise and they get partners with kind of limited liability to come and say, I would like the exposure to real estate. I will give you X amount of money to invest. And what we have seen is a trend for more of those investors to come and speak to us. And we've not done that many deals directly with them, but a lot of people have approached us saying, like, we were invested in a fund of your, someone you worked for in the past, would you do something with us directly? And that's because I think people want more control. They're saying they want more control and more access directly to what's happening on the ground. So, I think for us, it's not talking about investors generally in relationship with investors. And Christopher Daniel and Tristan Geffen spend a lot of time with investors of all sorts. And that's talking to them, understanding what the money markets are doing, what the capital markets are doing, what the interest is from different perspectives, so from different parts of the world. What's happening in the US impacts quite a lot how investors view the rest of the world often, but some of the Asian investors have got their own views as well. So many factors, which is why it's fascinating. But, the impact of interest rates, exchange rates in various countries, policies, governmental policies in various countries, whether it's fiscal or monetary, it's got a real impact on decision-making for investors. And you see flows of capitals from different parts of the world at different times. So I remember when I joined real estate, the Nordics were very, very big investors, particularly if you looked at Wall Street. There was lots of Swedish investors and lots of Irish investors before that. So you kind of have trends, and depending on regulation, waves of investors from all over the world. So for us, it's all about understanding those relationships, understanding what people want, and staying in contact with them. Often deals happen because you're in the right place at the right time. We are one of many partners, and depending on what's going on, you might be prioritized or not. And no matter how great the deal is, it's got to have, it's got to go through an IC who's got to be focused on doing that transaction.
Talk to me about assembling a high-performing team and a diverse high-performing team as well, because I know over the last few years you've worked quite hard at that. Can you just expand on what you maybe look for in people and the qualities and the skill sets that make people stand out?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I said at the beginning, we were going to come on to how we got to meet each other. And I guess when I started being involved in the management, which was from 2019 onwards, we were having conversations about who our investors were, where they came from and what they wanted. And I think as we saw more and more diverse investors, we also wanted to be more diverse ourselves. I think you get better ideas with people coming from all sorts of backgrounds and different genders as well. And I think us being aware that, until I joined, so with it all being middle-class white men, that we really realized we need to be making more of an effort to recruit other people. And I think actually just that change of mindset is what changed. And that changed, it changed the brief that I gave you, which was actually I want to see as varied people as possible. I don't want to see your typical surveyor who's got into property because their parents were into property. I'd love to see people coming from different backgrounds who think property is interesting, but we've got a slightly different perspective, whether it's because they've got a financial background, more of an accounting background, more of a retail background. And from that, we've assembled a really fantastic team. We've got, I think, over half the office is of foreign origins and not born in the UK. I would include myself, obviously, in that, which means for a very interesting cultural conversation in the office. But also from half the team is not MRCS, so qualified surveyor, which again means they see things slightly differently. And I think that aligns much more with what our investors are doing as well. So whether you're dealing with the private equity guys, a lot of them are Europeans or Americans, or even are, some of our partners, such as Aimco, Canadians. We've got a lot of new partners from Asia that we're doing work for on a kind of DM kind of basis. We've changed the team, and the time of people we've recruited has changed as well. So rather than being people who trade a certain field and knew what they were doing just in that field, we've looked for people very eager to learn and bright, who just want to develop both their kind of technical skills, their knowledge, as well as their professional network. And for us, is really important. Every business is slightly different. Every business got a slightly different culture, and it's actually much easier to integrate slightly younger staff. Still got the basics that can function on their own, but are eager to learn and absorb and progress in their careers, rather than people who've maybe worked in a certain type of organization, do things in a certain way. When you're a small business, as you will well know, all getting on is very important, and all having different opinions, but concluding a way of moving forwards that is cohesive.
Yeah, no, makes complete sense. As we look ahead, what are the plans for 2023, 24 and 25 and beyond, and how do you see the market and Quadrant taking advantage of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think our preferred route is always to source stock, do a field business plan and find the right partners for it. The difficulty is probably where the market is at the moment in terms of stock available to buy and the pricing of that stock. So it's very difficult to make returns stack up, particularly on the office side at the moment. There is so much stock that is not fit for purpose, that needs to be repurposed. We've got the skills to do it, but at the moment pricing hasn't come down enough to be able to afford to buy it for X, spend Y and make some money and sell it for Z. It needs to stack up, and it just doesn't. So I think there's a bit of a way to go down. I'm still looking at lots of opportunities. We've come close to a lot of things. We've got brown to green strategy, which is rather than whole-scale redevelopment and refurbishment, which is what we've been known for, is doing rolling refurb, spoil back floor. What we've been doing quite a lot is more of an advisory role, actually. And a lot of people come to us who've got some of those assets and those buildings that are coming. They've owned them for 5-6 years. They've collected the rent, and actually it's coming 1 or 2 years of income to the end of the leases. They need to do something, but often they don't have the boots on the ground. They don't have the skills to do it. So they're asking us for help, often creating new schemes, potentially adding more space, or certainly upgrading the spec to make them as close to best-in-class buildings as you can. So I see us definitely continuing that on the development management side, the asset management side as well, both on retail and offices. As I said, we've had quite a few mandates from people realizing retail has become so such a subsector, particularly retail has such a niche sector, where having the relationship with retailers is really important, and understanding really ahead of time what could happen to the assets. So being proactive rather than reactive. And I think the reality is a lot of these people are too busy. They don't have the staff to look into detail at just one asset and be on top of everything ahead of time. And that can really make a difference on performance at the moment. So more of the asset management, more of the development management. We launched our repurpose build business a couple of years ago on the retail side, which was aiming to find retail-based sites that were not functioning as well as they could. We bought our first asset with LaSalle Investment Management a few years ago, and that's a Waitrose in Hersham, where we're looking at doing a mixed-use scheme with some senior living, and from that we've looked more into the senior living sector, which again is considering the aging population, the cost of housing in the UK, and the housing shortage is a fascinating sector, which we believe in and would love to do more of that as well. So
an interesting time, and I guess lots going on, and a great, from a business perspective, working on these mandates to make sure that the business has got fee income and interesting projects and is current until the kind of the bid and ask price comes in, when you can kind of do more investment deals and take advantage of that as well. Couple more questions for you before we tie up. What are the differences? Because I know at the start of this conversation we spoke about you entering the market in 2008, and the word recession has been bandied around over the last 6 months or so. Certainly from the conversations I'm having, it's not as bad, or it won't be as bad as maybe people thought it could be. But what do you think are the differences in the market between now and that time, and what do you think the skills that people need to have to be able to succeed right now?
Yeah, so very interesting question. And we've been talking about it, as you say, in the context of there's been a bit of a downturn. Is it going to be a deep downturn? Is it going to be a long downturn? Obviously, the GFC was really deep, relatively long. I think the difference, the main difference, well, first point to make is I'm mid-30s and I'm one of the last people who has gone through a downturn. So I think there's a lot of people who haven't seen downturns in the market, particularly at the junior end. They've never experienced it and what happens. And suddenly, I think when there is a downturn, people start looking at the detail a lot more. I think it's really easy for assets to perform well when they're carried by the markets. Yields sharpen, and actually, yes, you do a bit of asset management, but have you really looked under every stone and done the best you can on every single point? Well, it's not really looked at until you get a bit more of a downturn. Suddenly people look at things much more forensically. So for me, that's the really interesting point. In terms of the market itself, biggest issue of 2008 was the banks, really, as we know. A lot of assets were over leveraged. As soon as things started to struggle a bit, everything unraveled. We don't have that issue this time for two reasons. One, the LTVs are not what they were, and actually it's not really an LTV issue this time. It's more around the ICR, so the covenants surrounding your interest to rent ratio, interest cover ratio. The second point is there's no liquidity crisis as such, because there's so many more lenders in the market. So historically we're really relying on quite a lot of the banks. But now the variety of lenders is huge, and we've got, just looking at our lenders on our assets, we've got traditional banks, we've got foreign banks, we've got debt funds, we have got foreign entities, we've got really a range of lenders, and they didn't really, a few were present in 2008, but not to the same scale. And a lot of people have raised debt funds and are ready to lend. The problem is the gap in where someone might have bought the asset, what is valued at now, and the fact that someone, the lender doesn't necessarily want to put more debt in, and someone's got to find that equity gap and finance it. But it's not, it's not what it used to be. I think in terms of the market as a whole, things have evolved. The traditional sectors are no longer dominant. I think there's a lot more operational real estate. So, we're talking about senior living, but obviously PRS, student accommodation, hotels, all of these sectors have really become institutional, and it's where a lot of people are underweight at the moment. So a lot of people are looking to expand in that area. Obviously ESG is huge now. Funny enough, I looked at sustainability as part of a school project in 2005, was fascinated by it. In 2008, the crisis meant that sustainability went at the bottom of the list. I don't think we'll have that this time, because the pressure both of shareholders as well as staff means that companies are having to deal with.
And occupiers,
exactly. So I think from that, I think sustainability is here to stay, and I think there's real opportunities there to understand what it actually means, and we're not doing greenwashing, we're talking truly understanding what it means and what you can do, as well as the society kind of impact, whether it's a partnership with a local school, such as we're looking to do that in 9 Elms. Where we can create a little garden and pay for a gardener to educate some of the inner city school kids on growing vegetables.
Yeah, that leads us to quite an interesting point, because you've been supporting a charity Reach Out for many years. I guess that probably fits into that S piece. Can you just elaborate and tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are very fortunate as an industry that most of us earn decent wages. Yes, of course, the cost of living crisis is impacting us all, but we're not having to choose between going to work and, pay for transport or feeding ourselves. And I think giving back is pretty important. There's a lot of people struggling out there, and a lot of people are born in circumstances that they didn't choose and don't necessarily have exposure to what could you do with your life, and people who have gone on to, set up their own businesses and be very successful. And I think Quadrant, being a business that was set up by two founders and has done very well, it meant we wanted to give back by explaining, getting kids perhaps to come and see our artists, understand what we do, and say, there's opportunities out there to do something else that you might not have thought about. So Reach Out is a charity that does mentoring. It was started as an after-school club, and it's now evolved into helping them with, going to university, putting CVs together as well, and then kind of getting a job eventually as well. And we've sponsored them for, I think, 6 or 7 years. And one of the things we do is actually organise workshops. And we've got one on Friday where all the kids come in and we make them go for an exercise of setting up a shop, show them shops, show them the offices, and they love it. They're all a bit reserved at the beginning, and by the end they love it. And the best thing we've ever had is a kid come up and say, "Look, that sounds fascinating. How do I get into this?" And really trying to inspire and give back is just so amazing. It's the best thing for us, and obviously, they're getting something out of it, hopefully, as well.
Amazing. It's great also for getting people into real estate and seeing that as a career option too. The question I ask everyone on the podcast is, if I was to give you £500 million of equity, who are the people, what property, in which place would you look to deploy that?
Right. Obviously, I think we've got a wonderful team, so I'm obviously going to say Quadrant. But the jokes aside, I think there's a lot of amazing people out there, and depending on what sector you want to invest in, do your research on the best people and go with them. It's probably what I would say. There's also some amazing big companies who, the likes of Blackstone and all the PE guys who know what they're doing. They've got the scale and they give you exposure to so many different sectors. So I'm quite, as is discussed before, I'm quite an all-rounder, quite a balanced person. I like a mix of sectors. Obviously, I'm going to back our own sectors. So retail for kind of the income aspect of it, super prime office development for the product you're creating, the long-term capital value appreciation and rental growth. And I think as a new sector, senior living, the fundamentals are there for the sector to grow and become more and more important. So there you go.
And location-wise, that's across the UK, London, and would you go further afield, or would you kind of keep it in those kind of markets?
No, I think we've thought about actually expanding to Europe, but the reality of it is you need to know your markets. And I think we can deal with the UK market. We've got, the right questions to ask. We understand the legal system. We understand the way to do business. We haven't got that in Europe. So I think UK is where I would stay, because it's what I know when I can understand and why I'm making a decision.
Vanessa, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I've really enjoyed hearing a little bit more about your story, what you and your business partners and colleagues at Quadrant are doing, and you're having a really positive impact on the market. So thank you for spending some time with me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the People, Property, Place podcast. If you found it insightful, feel free to share it with a friend or colleague, subscribe, give us a rating, like or comment. It helps tremendously. It'd be great to hear from you on LinkedIn. I'm super open-minded to recommendations of which guests you think we should get on the podcast or areas of the market that we should explore further. So do drop me a message. The People, Property, Place podcast is powered by Rockborn. The team recruit experienced talent for real estate private equity firms, investment managers, REITs, property companies and advisory firms across the investment, asset management, development, fund management, ESG, cap markets, investor relations and general practice space. So if you're considering your career options at the moment or looking to attract top talent to come and work for you, head over to the website www.rockborn.com, where you can find a wealth of resource to aid your search. Have a great day wherever you are, and I look forward to catching you next time.